And now that we know all about TypeScript, let's set our sights on another great technology called React. React is a declarative component-based JavaScript library that allows you to create reactive views in your web applications. It's not a framework in and of itself, and what I mean by that is that React is not opinionated about your data or your models or your controllers that you might find in any traditional MVC framework web application. It's purely a view layer that can be used in any application to create the interface for that application, and that makes it a really great candidate to fit with just about any other technology, including in the SharePoint framework. And not only that, but it's a really great technology, and it's actually quite fun to learn and to use whenever you're developing your own web applications. React is used quite often in both the latest versions of SharePoint, SharePoint Online, as well as in Office 365. So if you really want to dive into SharePoint framework and you want to be proficient in all the technologies that are required to do that, React is a really great technology to add to your developer's tool belt. And even if you have used React before, I do think this lesson is going to serve as a really great refresher for the technology. So what's all this fuss about? Well, let's find out. We're going to be creating our very first React application right now because I think the best way to learn is by doing. So if you'd like to follow along, you can download the starter solution using the link in the video description down below. And once you have that solution available, you'll have a folder called React Crash Course, such as we have here in our terminal. And now you can run an npm install to go ahead and install all the dependencies you're going to need for this particular solution. And once that's done, we can open up this solution in Visual Studio Code and have a look. So this is a pretty simple setup to get started. We have an index.html file. This is actually going to be the HTML page that we're going to be working in. And we're not actually going to be editing this. What we're going to be doing is loading our React application into this div with an ID of root. So that's really all you need to know about this HTML file. We also have in the source folder index.tsx, and this is the entry point, if you will, for this React application. It has a couple of imports at the top. It has this class called app, which is extending react.component, and within that it has a render method, which you'll see here is rendering some HTML. Also, at the bottom of this file, it is using a render function to actually take this component and to insert it into our HTML file using document.getElementById root. So let's see what this looks like. We're going to jump back into our terminal and we're going to run an npm run start. And this is going to start a local dev server. And then as you can see here, it's going to render our React component right into our HTML page over on the right. If I switch back into Visual Studio Code and we shrink this down, you can see as I change the HTML on the left and hit save, it's going to automatically update our application over here. Now, one of the first things you may notice in our app class over on the left within our render method, it is actually returning HTML, but this is not a template string. This is a special thing utilized in React called JSX, or in this case, it's actually TSX, which is the TypeScript version of that. And basically what that means is we can actually return HTML from our methods and mingle that with JavaScript expressions. This is not something that is specific to React. You can actually use JSX or TSX in just about any web application framework, and that's really great. But it is particularly useful in this case, and it's definitely something you're going to want to be familiar with when you're working with React. So just as a very simple example of what you can do with JSX, we can take up here above our return within our render method, we can say const name equals John, and we'll just set a variable called name. And then what we can do in our JSX is you can use the expressions or curly brackets, and then you can put in any type of JavaScript expression within those curly brackets. And as we save that, over on the right, you'll see, sure enough, that has been updated. And this doesn't just work with simple variables. You can see here, if I were to change this to first name, John, const last name equals Doe, we could come down here and say, you could certainly do first name and you could do two separate expressions like this. And if we were to save that, that's going to work just fine. You see it updates over here. Also, because it's just a regular JavaScript expression, you can do pretty much anything with this that you can think of that you could do in normal JavaScript. So for example, I could do first name plus space plus last name. That's one way to do it. And now you have a single expression rendering the same thing. You could also do an ES6 template string. So you could put the backticks around this, put your template string expression syntax around each of those. And as we save, once again, it's going to do the exact same thing. This is really cool because you can basically do any type of JavaScript that you'd like, but you can actually insert that into your JSX and it will automatically be handled by the JSX interpreter and rendered out as just regular old HTML to the page. And one thing that you should be aware of with JSX is that you always have to have a single top-level element. So for example, if for some reason we had a paragraph down here that was the address, we'll just put an address for now, because this is in a div, this is going to work just fine. So when we save, you're going to see the paragraph in our view over on the right. But if you would try to actually return that without a parent div, you'll see it's actually yelling at us. The linter says that's not going to work. And if you actually save that, it's going to fail to compile because JSX expressions must have one parent element. So just keep that in mind whenever you're composing your rendered HTML. So I'm going to undo that real quick. We'll take it back to just the H1 tag. And one quite important thing to note about React is that it is all about components. Everything that you create in React is going to be called a component. And even in this case, we actually have created, without even doing anything, a component called app. And as you'll see up here, we have class app extends React.component. So right now our React application consists of a single component, but really what React applications are all about is about creating many different components, and then you can compose your whole web application by reusing those smaller components many different times. And just as an example, in any typical web application, you may have things like drop-down menus or toggle buttons or modal dialogues, and each one of those things could be considered a component. And if you were to build that in React, you would create a drop-down menu component, and then you could reuse that everywhere where you wanted to have some sort of interactive drop-down menu. So let's go ahead and try that out. We're going to start with a really super simple component to demonstrate the most basic features of React components. This is pretty easy to get started. We're just going to go over to our source folder, and we're going to create a new file, and we are going to create greeting.tsx. And in any React component, you're always going to start with import star as React from React. That's just going to give you that base React functionality. And all React components consist of a class. So we're going to say export default class greeting extends React.component. And to get started, we want our greeting class that we've created here to have a public render method, which is going to return a JSX element. And generally your JSX returns look like this. You're going to return, and then in parentheses, you're going to put your HTML, and you would normally wrap this in a div or something in case you wanted to have multiple child elements, and we could put in hello React. So if I go ahead and save this, we can now utilize this component in our application by going back to index.tsx, and up here at the top, we're going to import that component that we just created. So let's import greeting from greeting. And with that imported, I'm going to delete our first name, last name stuff that we had down here, and we can utilize our greeting class just like an HTML element. And when we save that, you'll see over on the right, it has been updated. And if we switch to greeting and say, hello Kyle, and save, it's going to update over here. So this is the most basic React component you could possibly have. It doesn't do much at this point other than render out some hard-coded HTML, which probably isn't a particularly good use case for a React component. So let's add a little bit of dynamic content here to demonstrate a really important aspect of React components called props. So what I'd like to do in this case is I'd like to create a prop to allow, whenever this component is being used, we can change the name of who's being greeted. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to come up to the top here and we're going to add a TypeScript interface, and we're going to call this I greeting props. And this is typically the naming scheme you're going to see. I is for interface, and then you have the name of our component, which is greeting, and then you have props on the end. And this is basically describing the props object that is associated with this particular component. So in this case, I want a single prop called name of type string. And with that interface defined, we now have to inform our greeting class that it has some props. So before we do that, let's go down here to where we're extending react.component. And if you hover over this, you'll notice that right above there, it says class react.component, and it has this weird syntax with this less than and greater than symbol. And it says P equals empty object, S equals empty object. And this is what's called a TypeScript assertion. And that's kind of like saying, hey, let's create a class called React component, but by default, it has no props. The P equals empty object basically means by default, a React component has 0 props. It's an empty object. There's no props you can add to it. But with an assertion, what we can do is we can actually override that generic, that P equals empty object, and say, no, actually, in fact, the greeting component does have props. So we can override that P equals empty object and give it something else, give it a different interface to describe the specific properties for this component. The way we do that is we're going to use the assertion syntax, which is a less than and greater than symbol, and we're just going to override the P equals empty object by passing in I greeting props. And once we actually do that, if you were to save this, you're going to notice over on the right, it's going to say failed to compile, and you're going to feel very bad about yourself because it feels like you did something wrong. But actually what in fact happened is that we created a required prop up here. Name does not have a question mark in front of it, so this is a required prop for this component. And what it's saying is that I have not been provided my required prop whenever this greeting component was used. And that's actually used over in our index file. You'll notice here, there's our little red squiggly, and if you hover over it, it says property name is missing. So that means we need to pass it a name whenever we utilize this component now. So we can say name equals John, and if we hit save, it will no longer have that error. Now we're not actually using the name anywhere yet, so that's the next step. It still says hello Kyle. I actually want this to say hello John in this case whenever we pass in that name prop. So let's switch back to our greeting class, and within here we're just going to replace Kyle with a JSX expression. And the way you can access your props and your methods within your components is going to be this.props. That's an object that contains all your props. And then you can just say dot, and then there is our name right there, this.props.name. And now when we save this, we get hello John. And this is actually pretty cool because each component instance is totally separate from one another. So for example, I can now reuse this component as many times as I want, and I could say greeting name equals Jane. And if we add a second one, it's going to have totally different props than the previous instance. And while we're here in the browser, one thing that I would highly recommend that you go ahead and install now that you're working with React applications is what are known as the React developer tools. You can find a link to these down in the description of this video, and the way you get to those is you're going to open up your inspector inside of Chrome, and you're going to have a new tab down here all the way at the end called React. And if we go to these developer tools, you actually notice, just like you can look through your HTML DOM tree, you can look through a tree of your React application. So in this case, we have a component called app, and if we open that up, you'll see there are our two greeting components here. And this is a really great way to debug and inspect all of your individual React components. For example, we can click on this first greeting, and you'll see over on the right, here are our props. We have a prop called name, and it's equal to John. And I can actually click on that and edit it right in the DevTools. And as soon as I hit enter, you'll see it's updated in real time up here. So this is pretty cool, but we're still not doing anything interactive in our application, which is where I really think React shines. So let's create a new component. And in this case, I'm going to create a new file in our source folder called counter.tsx. And just as before, we're going to import star as React from React. And we're going to export a default class called counter extends react.component. And within this, we'll have a public render method that returns a JSX element. And within that, we'll go ahead and return, and I'll just put in some dummy HTML for now. So we'll put a div, and within that, we'll say count is currently equal to 0. So just to test this out and make sure it works, let's go ahead and import that to our index. We'll say import counter from counter. And then down here, we'll drop one of these on counter, and we'll go ahead and save that. And you can see, sure enough, there's our count. And down in our React DevTools, there's our counter right here. And as of right now, it has no props. So you don't see anything with it. It's really just hard-coded HTML. So let's add some stuff to it. Back in our counter.tsx file, we're going to do the same thing we did with greeting, and that we're going to create an interface to describe the props that are going to be available to this counter component. So that's going to look like interface I counter props. And within that, at the very least, let's give this some sort of label of type string so that we don't have to hard code count in here. And now that we've defined that interface, we can use that TypeScript assertion to say this React component does have props, and it's going to use the I counter props interface. And with that done, we can now replace count with this.props.label. So again, this is a required prop. So as soon as I save this, it will throw an error, but that just means we have to go back to our index and we have to provide a label. In this case, we'll do like an egg counter. So we'll say label equals eggs. And now, sure enough, we see eggs 0. Very exciting. So props are pretty great to be able to pass some data down to your component, such as in this case, we're passing things like name strings and the label string. But there's another aspect of React components that you should be familiar with, and especially when you have data that could change based on user interaction, this is going to be particularly useful, and that's going to be using the component state. The way that you implement the state for a component is very similar to the way we've implemented props. And just as before, the first thing to do is to create an interface to describe what that component state looks like. So in this case, let's jump into our counter.tsx file and let's create an interface called iCounterState. And in this case, I want a single state property called count, which is going to be of type number. And this is going to be how we're going to keep track of our counter. It's going to start at 0, and then every time a user hits a button, we'll increase that counter, and it'll go up and up and up. So just as before, this React component, when you hover over it, has a default state with no properties in it. So you'll see there it says p equals an empty object, that's the props, and then s for state equals an empty object. So just as before, we have to inform this component that we've created, this counter component, that it actually has some properties in its state. So we do that just by, after iCounterProps, we'll just say comma iCounterState. And the way that you're going to use your state in your render template is going to be very similar to the way we use props. We're going to replace this 0 in this case with this.state.count. Now you'll notice whenever we save this, it actually is going to throw an error. And it's going to say cannot read property count of null. And this is indicating to us that the variable this.state is actually equal to null. And the reason is because we've never actually initialized our state. So we've described an interface that says our state should have a count, but we've never set that up anywhere. We've never said this is what our state is equal to. And the way we're going to do that is by providing a constructor to this class. So to do that, we can just go down here above our render method and put in constructor. And your constructor within your React components must accept a props argument. And this is going to be of type iCounterProps. And not only that, but within this constructor, you must make a super call. And you even notice it has the red squiggly right now. If I hover over it, said must contain a super call. And basically what that means is it's going to go up to the React component, and it's going to go to its constructor and run it using the props that it's been passed. And then once the React component has done all the internal things it needs to do with the props, you can then do whatever you want inside the constructor. And that looks like this. We're going to type in super props, just like that. And within this constructor right down here, we can set our initial state. So we can say this.state equals an object, and then it needs to be in the same format as our state interface up here. So we'll set count is initially equal to 0. And now when we save this, our ugly error message disappears. And then sure enough, we now see eggs are equal to 0. And if you look down in your React developer tools and we click on our counter component, you'll see it now has both props and state. And if I wanted to update our count and put in 12, for example, as soon as I hit enter there, it will actually update it in our view up above. So we are going to add a button that allows users to increment the count every time we click on it. But before we do that, I do want to demonstrate one other thing, which is going to be an optional prop, because that's going to be something you use quite often. For example, with this counter, maybe we want to be able to set an initial count. Maybe we don't always want to start at 0. And to do that, we can go over here in our iCounterProps interface and we can add an optional property. So we'll set initial count $:, to indicate it's optional, and this will be of type number. And with that in place, we can now say in our initial state, we can say if you have an initial count, that's going to be our count within our initial state. If not, start at 0. And we can do that using a ternary operator. So we can say this.props.initial count. If you have that, go ahead and use this.props.initial count. Otherwise, use 0. And I'll shrink the sidebar down so we have a little bit more room here. And with that in place, this is still going to equal 0 here. But if we were to go back to our counter, and let's make 2 of these. So maybe we'll have a bread counter and an eggs counter. But on the eggs, we can set an initial count equal to 12 in this case. And you may think you can pass in 12 because this looks like HTML. So you would be accustomed to just passing in 12 there. But that actually won't work because that's a string. And in JSX, when your attribute is not a string, you're actually going to pass it as an expression, which is going to be the curly brackets, like so. And then when we save that, it will have an initial count of 12, as you can see there. But our bread counter is defaulting back to 0. Okay, so this is cool so far, but let's actually add some interactivity to these components. So in our counter, what I want to do is down in our render template, let's add a button. And whenever you click on this button, it's not doing anything right now, but we actually want it to increment the count within our state. So before we do that, let's go ahead and so I don't have to hard code the plus in there, let's add another optional property up here. So this will be called button label $? Equals of type string. And just like we used a ternary operator in our state whenever we're using this.props.initial count, you can do the same thing in your JSX expressions. So I can replace this plus with this.props.buttonLabel. And if that's truthy or set, we can say use this.props.buttonLabel. Otherwise, use a default value. And we'll put in like an emoji plus in this case. So that gives us a default plus on both of these buttons. But if in our index we wanted our egg counter to have a button label equals, and we'll actually use an egg. And then maybe over on the bottom one, button label equals, and I'm sure there's a bread emoji. Oh, I get 2 options. There we go. So now you can see we can customize the label on each of those. They still don't do anything, so that'll be the very next thing that we're going to look at. So in order to add interactivity to our components in React, we need to use what's called event binding. We basically need to say, when this happens, then do this. So in our counter component, we are going to create a custom method within this class that's going to be executed when the button is clicked. And that looks like this. We're going to say public increment, return type will be void. And before we do anything with this, let's just make sure it works. So I'm just going to say console.log button pressed. And the way we actually have this method be executed when the button is clicked is we simply say on the button, we say on click equals, and then in a JSX expression, we say this dot increment. And let's open the console in our dev tools down here. And now you'll see when I click the button, it actually says button pressed. And if I click again, it's going to increment that little counter to the left each time I click. So that looks great. But before we can actually increment our count each time we click, I do need to demonstrate one other thing that you're going to run into whenever working in your React components. And let's just say, for example, you wouldn't actually want to do this, but just as an example to help demonstrate this, let's say that you wanted to console log this.props.button label every time that you clicked on this button. So let's give this a try. We're going to go ahead and save this. It may seem at first like all is well, but you'll notice as soon as we click on the button, it's going to freak out and say, wait a second, I cannot read property props of undefined. And the debugger in you may think, well, okay, that means props is on undefined, so let's just console.log this. And if we save that and give it a shot, when I click on the button, you'll notice down here it is actually logging undefined, which means that the this keyword itself is undefined whenever this method is being executed. And this can be very confusing because if you're accustomed to writing classes in ES6 or in TypeScript, you generally have the this keyword available to you. In React, you do not. On all of your custom methods, the this keyword is not available by default. And that means we don't have this.props or this.state or any of the other methods and properties that are available on the React component class. And I will say that even as someone who's built a lot of React applications, this gets me all the time. And this is going to be something, I guarantee you, it's going to be something that you wrestle with whenever you're writing your own React applications. It's just something that we have to deal with. The reason that this happens is for performance reasons. The folks over at Facebook, for whatever reason, found that it is faster if you don't bind the this keyword to all your methods. So we have to explicitly say, in our custom increment method, I want the this keyword to be available. There's two ways to fix this. I'm going to show you both and you can decide which one works best for you. The quickest and easiest way is probably just in our onClick method. We can not just call this.increment, but we can say this.increment.bind this. And when we save that, you'll notice now when we click on a button, it's not undefined. We get all of the properties on the this object. And that means if I were to go over here in our increment method and say console.log this.props.button label, whenever we save this, sure enough, if I click on the egg, it's going to log an egg. If I click on the bread, it's going to log bread. So as I mentioned, there's actually two ways to do this. This is the first, is to just use .bind every time that you're going to call a particular method within your component class. The other way to do this is to actually do this in your constructor. And I actually prefer that, especially in complex applications. You might bind the same method to 10 different things within your view, and typing .bind this every time you want to call that method gets a bit tedious. So I actually prefer to delete this and just call onClick equals this.increment, but then up in our constructor, I typically leave a spot for bind methods. And within our constructor, we can just say this.increment equals this.increment.bind this. So we're actually doing the binding of the this keyword once whenever this counter class is instantiated. And then every time we use this.increment from there on, it's going to be available in that method. So now if we save this, it's going to work the exact same way. You'll notice here, I click on egg, we log an egg. I click on bread and we log that. Great. So now that the this keyword is available in the onClick method for this button, you may think, well, okay, so let's increment our counter. Let's say this.state.count++. That's definitely something I've tried to reach for when I was first starting with React. And you'll notice the linter doesn't like that, but just to demonstrate, if I save this, because it's probably something you'll see at some point, it says cannot assign a count because it is a constant or read-only property. And you're going to see this message because you cannot modify your state directly. You can't just say this.state.whatever equals a new value. React will not let you do that. It will actually throw an error. You can set your state directly inside of your constructor for your class. That's kind of a special case whenever you initialize your state. We're saying this.state equals. You can do that in the constructor, but from there on out, you're not allowed to actually modify it. And the way that you do actually get this to work is you're going to use a special method called this.setState, which accepts an object that essentially just describes the properties in your state that have changed. So in this case, we can say count is now equal to this.state.count plus 1. And now using that setState method, if we were to click on this, you'll see the counter actually increments each time we click on the button. Yay. The reason why they use this .setState is because behind the scenes there is what's called the React DOM. It's basically a tree that you're looking at in these React developer tools here. And what you're doing is every time counter has a state change, so when the state changes from 24 to 25, you're going to see that little flash of yellow, and that's the React DOM detecting that a change occurred, and so it goes back and it re-renders the component itself. And rather than re-rendering every time you set state to a new value, it can actually batch the state update. So if you change 5 state values inside of this component, it's only actually going to re-render it once, which makes the React app a lot faster. You may also have noticed that every time we increment the count in our state, the template is actually being updated automatically. We don't have to go in our increment method here and say, go to the span or the div where we have our count and set its inner HTML to this new value. And that's one of the key features of React in that it is reactive. That's where the name comes from, is reacting to our state changes automatically. And this is super powerful because that means you could have this really complex application that has some state to it. And then every time your state changes in one area of the application, that automatically persists throughout the rest of the areas of your application. So the counter component is pretty cool, and I think it accurately helps us demonstrate a lot of the key features of state within your React components and applications. But I do think it's worthwhile to go ahead and build a little bit of a more complex component that's actually going to demonstrate perhaps a more practical implementation of what real React apps are going to look and work like. So in this case, we're going to be building a reminders list component that will track things to do or a shopping list or whatever it is that you want. So let's start by creating a new file called reminderslist.tsx. And within here, as always, we will import star as React from React. And we will export a default class reminders list extends react.component. Let's go ahead and set up our constructor in here, which will accept props. And then it'll do a super call with props. We'll set out an area for binding our methods, as well as setting our initial state. Let's also create a public render method, which is going to return a JSX element. And let's go ahead and return a div from this particular one that will just simply have, for now, let's put an H2 with reminders. I do know that we're going to have both state and props on this particular reminders list, so let's go ahead and set up interfaces for those up here at the top. So let's create an interface reminders list props, and that's going to contain, at the very least, let's put in a list name. So let's have a string that'll contain the name for our list, and we'll also have an interface called reminders list state. And the state of this particular reminders list will contain an array of reminders. In this case, it'll be an array of strings. Now let's use our TypeScript assertion to go ahead and notify our reminders list component that it should utilize both the props and state that we've defined up above. So we'll put in that assertion here, and we'll pass in reminders list props and reminders list state. Then in our constructor, we should set props to be of type reminders list props, like so. And we should always initialize our state down here. So we'll say this dot state equals reminders will initially equal an array, and we should probably just put a couple in here for us to play around with. So we'll put in make a sandwich and make a pie. All of my examples tend to involve food, don't they? Okay, so now that that is done, let's go ahead and replace our reminders here with this.props.listName. We can go ahead and put that up here. And for now, we'll just put in a placeholder for reminders appear here. Great. So we have our reminders list component that we've set up here. Let's now import that into our index file. So we'll import reminders list from reminders list. And let's go ahead and drop one of those down here. Reminders list, list name equals things to do. And when we save that, hopefully we'll see our reminders list right there. So down in our React Dev Tools, you'll notice there's our new component right here. And if we click on that, sure enough, it has our list name prop as well as a reminders property in our state, which has make a sandwich and make a pie as array items in that array. So the first thing we should do is we should list out our reminders in the content or in the render of our particular component. So let's jump back into reminders list, and down here in our render, let's go ahead and create an unordered list. And what I want to do is for each of the items in that reminders array within our state, I want to go ahead and render a list item, which will contain the content of that reminder. So we haven't done this before because we're actually iterating over an array and we want to do something for each item in that array. And there's really no special syntax to do this inside of JSX. How you do this is up to you, but typically what you're going to find most people do is they'll use a JSX expression and they will map over each item in that array, and then that map function will return a new JSX element. So as an example, in this case, we could say this.state.reminders.map, and then for each reminder inside of that array, and we'll use an arrow function in this case, we'll say return list item, and then we'll just output our reminder, which is going to be a string. So basically all this is doing is just saying for each reminder, return a list item. And as we save here, you'll see in our web browser, there are our two reminders that are initialized in the state of this component. And because React is reactive, we could go down into our dev tools down here, and sure enough, anytime the state changes, so if this changes from make a sandwich to make a burger, that's automatically going to be updated in our render template. So one thing you may actually notice is we have some errors popping up in our console now that we've done an array iterator to output an LI for each one of these reminders. So if I go ahead and open up the console here and we take a look at that, it says, if we scroll up a bit, each child in an array or iterator should have a unique key prop. And this is a warning you're going to get every time you do some sort of iterator where you're outputting JSX for each item in an array. And it's just something you have to do in React. For performance reasons, they prefer that whenever you have a loop, any type of loop that's outputting something on the parent element that you return from that iterator, you also add a key property. And the key can equal anything you want. It just has to be unique for each one of the items in that loop. And this is pretty easy to do in a map function because what I can do up here is I can add a second argument, which is going to be the counter. So it's going to be a zero-base index counter for that array. And what we can do is just pass in I as the key for that list item. And if I clear the console down here and we are to save, you'll see after that refreshes, we no longer get that warning. Okay, so this is looking pretty great at this point. We have our reminders list. It is reactive, so as soon as we make a state update, it's going to update itself. But we also want the user to be able to add new reminders to that array. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to have an input with a button down below our list here where they can type in and then hit the button and it'll add an item to our list up above. Let's go ahead and create the HTML for that. Down here, we'll just put input type equals text, value equals, and we'll just put a blank value there for now. And then down below, we'll have a button, and within that, we'll just have a plus button that they can click on. So this is what that's going to look like. You'll be able to type into there, hit the button, and it's going to add whatever you typed to your reminders list up above. You'll notice you can't actually type anything into this input right now. And that's because what you have to do to be able to capture input on a React component is you need to actually have a state variable that stores what is the value of this input. And you also need to listen to the onChange event of this input and update that state variable every time a change occurs. This is a technique called input binding, and you are going to have to do this anytime you have an input in your React components to be able to track what the state of that input is going to be. And this is what it looks like. Let's scroll up to the interface here for our iReminders list state, and we're going to add a new state property called new reminder label, which will be of type string. And you'll see down here when we're setting our initial state, it's saying, wait a second, we need a new reminder label value, which will initially start as a blank string. And now what we can do is in our input itself, we can bind the value of this to that state property. I can say this.state.new reminder label. So the value of this input will always equal whatever the state is of this new reminder label. And as I refresh here, you still can't type in here because we're not handling any state changes, but it is now bound to that and it will react to changes to this variable. So for example, if this were to equal new label and I hit enter, you'll see the input has now changed and it's reacted to that state change. In order to allow the user to actually change it when they type into the input, we're going to do a very similar technique to what we did with our button click and our counter, in that we are going to have an event that occurs on this input, and then we'll have a custom method that handles that event. So let's go ahead and create that method now. Down here in our reminders list component, let's create a public update new reminder label, which will return void. And for now, just to make sure that the event actually works, we'll just do a console.log new label changed. And with that in place, our update new reminder label method, we can say on our input on change equals this.update new reminder label to bind it to that particular custom event. And if we save this, sure enough, anytime we type something into, let me open the console down here. Anytime I type something into this input, if I hit a key, it's going to say new label changed right down here. So that's all good and well, but how do I actually get the value of whatever was typed in to that input? The good news is this method down here can actually accept an argument called event. And if you want to type this, which is probably a good idea, it has kind of a weird type in React, just kind of the way they do form events. It is called react.form event, and then you use an assertion of type HTML input element. And that looks a little weird, but that's just kind of the way they do it in React. But now what we can do on this event, if you were just looking the autocomplete, we can say event dot. It has all kinds of stuff on it, so we can tell all kinds of things about what occurs in that event. But in particular, we have current target, and then that has a dot value on it. So we can actually grab event.currentTarget.value, and that's actually going to give us the value of the input. And if we were just console.log event.currentTarget, you'll see in our console over on the right, whenever I type, event.currentTarget is actually equal to that input itself, which is handy. And if we were to console log event.currentTarget.value, you'll see now it's going to log whatever key I type in. Now it's only going to do one key at a time, and the reason is although we are capturing this event and we're getting the new value that's been typed into that input, React is then going and saying, okay, this input's value is bound to this.state.newReminderLabel, which is still equal to an empty string. So even though we type something in, it's immediately going back and resetting it to an empty string, because that's what the state is whenever we type into this input. So in order to get this to actually work, we're actually going to need to use this.setState, just like we did in our counter, and we're going to set the state of our new reminder label to equal event.currentTarget.value. And because we are using the this keyword before this works, we do need to bind this method to allow it to use the this keyword. Just that weird React-y thing that we have to do with our custom methods. So I'm going to come up here to our constructor and say this.update new reminder label equals this.update new reminder label.bind this. And with that done, we can actually now type into the input, and you'll even notice down here on our reminders list, if we look at our new reminder label value, it, as we type, every single key we type in, it's going to update that new reminder label state property. Great. So now whenever a user types in here, we know what they've typed in. So what we can do is we can wire up our button click for this plus button to basically say, go to your array up here and add this new reminder label to it. So let's create a custom method for our button click. This will be called public add new reminder. That'll return type void. And let's go ahead and bind our button to it. So up here we'll say onClick equals this dot add new reminder, like so. And within this method down here, we'll say this dot set state. And we need to set the state of our reminders array to equal some value. Now you can't do a normal push here. You couldn't just say reminders.push because you need to set the whole array. So up above here, we could say const updated reminders equals this dot state dot reminders, and then updated reminders dot push this dot state dot new reminder label. And then now we have an entire updated array, and we can just set reminders to equal updated reminders in this case. Now, once again, we are using the this keyword in multiple places in this method. So let's not forget to go up to our constructor here and bind the this keyword to that method. This dot add new reminder equals this dot add new reminder dot bind this. And now when we save that, we can say test and hit the plus button, and it will add it to our list up above, which is great. Now you notice that it's not actually clearing out the input here, so I can just keep clicking on plus. That's probably not ideal in this case. So let's also go down to that method and let's also update the new reminder label to equal an empty string whenever we update the state. And let's hit save. And you'll see now I can say make a burger, and it empties out that input. Make some cookies. Each time I add a new item, it's going to give us a fresh input to work in. Great. So there is a bit of a shorthand down here. We don't actually have to, in this case, use this temporary variable. We can delete this updated reminders. And what I see a lot of folks doing in the React world is you can use the ES6 spread operator in this case. And what that does, we can set reminders to an entirely new array, but inside of this new array, we can spread out or explode this .state.reminders. And that'll basically take all the items in that array and stick them into this new array. And then on the end of that array, we can add this .state.new reminder label. And this will do the exact same thing that we had before, just a little bit more compact version of that. So you can see same exact output as we had before. Another thing you may want to do here is you may not want to add empty reminders. So we should probably add here if this .state.new reminder label .length is falsy, meaning it doesn't have a length, we can simply return at the top there. And then that way, whenever we try to add an empty reminder, it doesn't actually do anything, but if we type something in, it will add that. And with that, the time has come to go ahead and add some functionality to each of our reminders within our reminders list so that we can edit them and or mark them as complete. Now, before we just jump into our reminders list component here and we start making changes and somehow track which reminders are actually being edited and what their new values are, I think this is a good time to take a step back and think about the best way to architect our React components in this case. And in general, you want to create a separation of responsibility and concern so that each of your component really only does one thing. If you can describe what your component does and that description contains more than one thing, there's a good chance that that could be a good candidate for a whole separate component. So in this case, our reminders list can simply list out our reminders, and then we can have an individual reminder component that can actually handle the updates and the edits and the mark complete / delete in this case. So let's give that a shot. Let's go into our source folder over here in our project, and we'll create a new file called reminder.tsx. And as always, we will import star as React from React, and we will export a default class reminder extends react.component, And let's go ahead and define a props and state interface for this component. So we'll do interface I reminder props, and this will just accept a single prop. It needs to know what the reminder is that we've been passed. So we'll do reminder of type string, and then we have our state interface, which will be I reminder state. This will just have a single property in it. We need to track whether or not we are currently editing this reminder, and that'll be of type Boolean. So let's pass those into our component assertion here, I reminder props as well as I reminder state. To inform our component, we're going to use those interfaces. And let's set up a constructor which will accept props of type I reminder props and do our super call for props. And then we'll just set up a place where we can bind our methods, and we'll set initial state here. This dot state equals editing will default to false. Great. So let's also add a public render method, which will return a JSX element as always. And let's just return, in this case, we'll add a div. And for now, let's just put in the reminder itself into that div. Whoops, not reminder, but this dot props dot reminder. Okay, so that's a pretty good start. Let's go ahead and jump back into our reminders list, and we will import the reminder component into this component. Let's go to the very top, and we will import reminder from reminder. And now that that's been imported into this component, we can utilize it. And as opposed to just outputting the reminder label here, we'll create an entirely new component within this LI. So this will be reminder, and we need to pass it the reminder, which will equal the instance of reminder from our iterator up here. And let's go ahead and save that and see what it looks like. And you actually notice there is no difference in the UI up here. But because we've architected this as a component within a component, you'll notice down in our React DevTools, if we were to open this up, there is our reminders list. But then within that, for each reminder, we have a dedicated reminder component, which has the reminder as a prop, as well as whether or not it is currently being edited. So that might seem like a little bit of extra work, but to be honest, this is a good thing because you're going to find that rather than having one monolithic component that does absolutely everything, you can really break up your components and define very small subsets of functionality, and you can just focus on that component doing one thing really well, and then you don't have to worry about the rest of your application. It reduces the scope in a lot of cases of the complexity of the things that you have to build. And not only that, but it makes pieces of your application a lot more portable because now you don't have one very specific, very big component that's really only good in one place in your application. You have a lot of little components that you can use to compose lots of other pieces of your application, which is generally a best practice. So let's go ahead and go into our reminder component, and we'll start to scaffold out what it's going to look like whenever we actually can make our reminder editable. So first of all, I want some sort of button on each reminder that'll allow us to toggle edit mode. So let's just add a button here down below this .props.reminder. And within this button, we will put a pencil icon. So that'll be the indication that you can edit, which you'll see will show up over here. Now what I want to do when you click on this button is I want to toggle this editing state up here. So that's going to toggle between false and true. When it's true, that means we are editing, and we'll switch this out for a text input so we can actually change the value of that reminder. And when we're not editing, we'll just show a normal label, just like you see here. So before we can do something with the button click, we need to create a method within our class to handle that click. So let's create a public toggle editing, which will return void. And that will simply set this .set state editing will equal the opposite of this .state .editing. And we are using the this keyword in this method. So let's go ahead and bind that up here. This .toggle editing equals this .toggle editing .bind this. And now we can go ahead and bind this button's on click to this .toggle editing. and you won't actually see anything when we click this, but if I open up the dev tools down here, and let's go to the first one, make a sandwich, you'll notice over here it says editing false, and if I click, that goes to true. If I click again, it goes back to false. So I can just keep clicking to toggle that back and forth. We should probably have some sort of indicator to the user that you're editing, so let's actually change the label of this button based on which state you're in. We can do that with a quick and easy ternary operator. So we'll change this to an expression and we'll say this.state.editing. And if that's true, then we'll have a save icon or a floppy disk. And otherwise, you can go ahead and put in that pencil that we had before. There we go. So with that ternary operator in place, you'll see the icon on the button changes based on what state you're in. And that looks great. So we also want to change this here, which is currently just a hard-coded label. It's not editable, obviously, because it's not an input. Whenever we are editing, we need to actually switch this to an input so that the user can actually select the text and change what's in that input. So right now, this is just being output as this.props.reminder right in our render template. And what I could do is I could do a ternary operator just like we did with our button, but I actually find that ternary operators are very handy in your render templates when they do something very short, when it's this or this, and in this case it's just a disk or a pencil, and that's very short and simple. It's very obvious when somebody's reading this what that's doing, but I don't tend to utilize them when I'm going to do something more complex. Like in this case, I'm going to have two totally different elements. I might have different HTML in this template. And based on the state of editing or not, I don't want to create this huge ternary operator that might be a little bit confusing to look at inside of our render method. And what you can very easily do is just kind of dedicate a method within your class to be able to handle that. And then you can put all the logic for that, what is basically a ternary operator, that if else, into that dedicated method and just reference that method in your render method here. So let's see what that looks like. We'll just create a method down here. This is going to be called public reminder, which will return JSX element. And within here, we'll just say let reminder of type JSX element. So we'll just declare that variable first. And then down below here, we'll say if this.state.editing, then reminder is equal to an input, type equals text, value equals this.props.reminder. Else reminder is going to equal to, let's just put in a span with this.props.reminder. And then at the end, we will return reminder. So that's essentially a ternary operator. It's totally up to you how you want to do this. But again, I'm just trying to demonstrate the various techniques you might see or might utilize in your React applications. In this case, you could just take something as simple as display this or that, and you could offload that logic to its own method, which we're doing in this case. And now that we've done this, first of all, we are using the this keyword. So once again, let's do that Reacty thing that we always do when we use the this keyword. It's just something you have to do. You have to get used to. We're going to say this dot reminder equals this dot reminder dot bind this. And with a this keyword bound, we can now go down into our render template and we'll replace the this dot props dot reminder with this dot reminder, and we'll call that method just like so. And when we save, you will see when we edit, we get an input box that currently we can't change because we haven't updated our state or anything, and we haven't listened to the change event on that input, but we can toggle back and forth between edit mode and display mode, which looks great. And finally, let's do something with this input when the user changes it. So I can't currently type into that input. So we'll create a method to handle that change just like we did on this add new reminder input down here. So let's create a public change reminder, which will accept an event of type react.form event with an assertion of HTML input element. And then this will return void. And then within here for now, let's just say console.log event.current target.value. So let's just log the current value of the input every time we change that. And with that change reminder event created up here in our input, we will go after the value and we'll say onChange equals this dot change reminder. So now when you go in and you edit make a pie and I hit A, whoops, we don't have our console open, but you'll see there it logged make a pie A. Now again, it's doing the same thing initially that our add new reminder label is doing, where it's adding the A, but it's immediately resetting it back because our prop has not changed in this case. Our prop that's being passed down, in which this input's value is being bound to, has not updated. And so until that prop updates, this value of this input will not change even if the user types into it. Behind the scenes it changes, but then React is changing it right back. So the question becomes, how do we make that change? Well, the first thing you may try, and you may reach for whenever you do this, is you may try to say, okay, when you change reminder, set this.props.reminder equal to event.currentTarget.value. And you'll notice the linter doesn't like that. And sure enough, if I try to save this, you're going to get a big ugly error that says cannot assign to reminder because it is a constant or a read-only property. And this error message demonstrates a very important aspect of React, and that is called one-way data flow. And what I mean by that is whenever you pass props from a parent component down to a child component, those props are read-only in the child, meaning you can only push data down to a component's children. You can never push data back up from the children to the parent. That's why they call it one-way data flow, as your parents set their state or their props, and they can in turn pass that state and those props down to all of its children components. But you can never at any point have a child say, hey, my prop reminder now has a value of this. That's simply not allowed in React. So the first consideration anytime you need to update your state or your props in any component within a React application is, where does that data live? Because the only place you can change it is at the source of truth for that data. For example, in this case, we have a reminders list component, and within this component, we have a state which has our array of reminders. So if I ever want to make any change to this reminder right here that is called make a sandwich, if I want to edit this, if I want to delete it, if I want to do anything to this reminders array, that change must occur in this component because this is the source of truth for this data. So we know that we can't do this. So let's do a couple of undos here and take us back to a working application where we're just logging out the new value. And now our application is working again, and we know that the change to the array must occur at the source of truth, which is the reminders list. So we know that. Let's go ahead and write a method in this case in this class, this reminders list class, that's going to handle updating an item in the array. So let's go down to the bottom here. We'll create a method called public update reminder. This is going to take an index of type number and a value of type string. And this will return void. And within this, we're basically going to update the array at index with a new value. It's going to be very simple. So we'll say const updated reminders equals this.state.reminders. And then updated reminders of index will now equal value. And we can say this.setState reminders is now equal to updated reminders. So all we're doing in this case is we're going to update our state with the new reminder that has been updated here. And we are using the this keyword. So as always, let's go ahead and bind the this keyword to our update reminder method. We can do that up in our constructor. This.update reminder equals this.update reminder.bind this. Okay, so now we have a method in the reminders list that will handle updating a particular reminder. How do we get the child to actually execute this method? And what we'll actually do in this case is we will pass this method update reminder. We're going to pass that as a prop to our child component reminder. So let's do that now. We're going to jump into reminder. We'll go up to our props interface because we want to add a new prop here, and we'll call this update reminder, which will take both an index of type number as well as a value of type string, and that should be return type void. So we've added a new required prop, but the prop is actually a method, and we're specifying what arguments and return type that prop should have whenever we're creating this particular component. And now what we can do is down in our update change reminder event that occurs down here, you can see we have the new current target value. So we can take that and we can say this.props.update reminder. And again, this takes an index and a value. We're going to come back to index and we'll look at that in just a moment, but I'm going to hard code 0 in here for now. And then we can basically say, so this reminder now has this new value. And we should also make sure that because we're using the this keyword, as always, that means we have to bind the this keyword to this change reminder method. So let's go up to our constructor and we'll say this.change reminder equals this.change reminder.bind this. Okay, so when we save, React's going to freak out because we now have a new required prop that's not being used. So that means on our reminders list, you'll go up to the render method here and you'll see, hey, wait a second, I don't have all my required props. So we'll add update reminder equals, and then we'll pass a reference to this.update reminder. So once we do this, this will actually work, at least for the most part. So let's take a look at make a sandwich. You'll see here if I change this to make a burger, it will in fact update, and I can save that, and that works great. And you can also see down here in our reminders list, if we open this up, notice on the right, we have make a burger, make a pie. As I update this, if I change this back to sandwich, you can see the array itself is updating in real time. So the change is occurring on the reminders list, which is then in turn passing a new prop down on each update to the child reminder component. So likewise, you'll see here this reminders prop, or this reminder prop, which is read only, is updated in real time as well as that change occurs. And you also see there is that update reminder, which is bound. So that's the update reminder method that is bound to the parent component in this case. So that's great. That seems like it's working really well. However, if you remember, we hard-coded a 0 into our reminder component right down here. You can see we hard-coded this.props.update reminder 0, which is the index of the item that needs to be updated. So it worked great when we actually did update the first item in our array, but if we try to update another one, as soon as I make a change, you'll see that's going to start to update up here. And if I try to keep typing, it's doing some very weird stuff, which is not ideal. So we need to fix that. So the debugger and you may think, well, it needs an index, so I'm going to pass in index as a new prop to this component, and that will fix it. And that is true. But one thing you do want to think about in your React applications is you want to deal with state as little as possible. The less state you have in all of your components, the less you have to deal with and the less places you have to go to update things. And in this case, we need to really think about what does reminder do. If you think about reminder not in the context of a reminders list, but as just a singular reminder, it has no context. It doesn't know that it's in an array of reminders. The only thing this reminder component knows is that it gets a prop called reminder. It has some sort of method that executes whenever that reminder should be updated, and it has a state of editing true or false. Those are the only three things it has to worry about, and that's simple. It's really good to have very nice, simple components. If you were to add index as a prop here, suddenly, if I come into this component, I'm going to be like, well, what's index? What does that have to do with a singular reminder? Why do we have an index? This isn't an array. Why does that matter? And so you have to be careful about that. It's certainly possible because you can do whatever you want in React to pass your props and your state all over the place, but that's going to get very unwieldy very quickly. So perhaps a better approach in this case would be in our reminder component to take this 0 out and say the only thing I should have to pass whenever we are updating reminder is, hey, something changed. Here is my new value. I don't care what index I am. I'm just going to give you the new value. You can go do with that what you want. And that also means we need to scroll up to the top in our interface and we need to delete the index from here as well. So we just have an update reminder prop that's just going to say, hey, here's the new value, return void. That's all we care about in this component. If I save, React's going to get angry once again because there's a mismatch now in our reminders list, we're now trying to assign a parameter with 2 arguments to a prop with 1, and it doesn't like that. In order to fix this, we need to somehow provide the index to the method in reminders list, but only accept the new value from the reminder component. And we can actually do that using an arrow function. So in an arrow function, we can take the return value of whenever this update reminder prop is called, which will be value of type string, and then we can map that to this.update reminder, which accepts an index and a value. We already have the index because if you remember before, we have this I right here. So we'll just say I, comma, value. And if I were to save that, we now have a working first item. So I can say make a burger and hit save. But not only that, we can also update the second one to be make cookies. And I am getting very hungry. And we can use the exact same pattern to create a delete or a mark complete button in this case. So let's try that just to get a little more practice passing props back and forth between our components. We're going to do this again with a new button on that reminder component. So down here, what we'll do is we'll create a new prop for delete reminder, which will accept no arguments because the only thing that this particular reminder, the singular reminder component, should worry about is that, hey, we're going to notify the parent that we want to be deleted. It can't actually handle the delete because the source of truth for this array item is actually in the reminders list. So we'll accept a single prop of delete reminder, and then let's have a button down here that will be button on click equals this dot props dot delete reminder. And within there, we'll put a trash can emoji. And we'll go ahead and save that. So that will cause an error because now we have yet again another required prop that we are not passing down in reminders list. So let's go back here to our reminders list and we'll fix this by creating a method to handle the delete. So down here at the bottom, let's go ahead and add public delete reminder, and this only needs a single argument of index of type number. This will also return void. And the way we can do this is we can say const updated reminders equals this.state.reminders, just like we did above in our update reminder. But this time, if we want to delete an item at the index, we can say updated reminders.splice index 1. So that'll remove one item at the index. And then we can just say this.setState reminders is now equal to updated reminders. So now that we have this method delete reminder, we can now pass that down to our reminder. So here, let's make a little bit more room. We have our update reminder, which is using this arrow function, and we'll do the same thing here. We'll say delete reminder equals, and then the arrow function, in this case, doesn't have any arguments because our child delete reminder prop does not know the index of this particular one. But then we can map that to this.delete reminder of I, like so. And if we were to save this, we now have a nice little delete button over here. And if I were to delete that, it's going to delete an item, test1, test2. And if we delete the middle one, you can see, sure enough, that works great. Okay, so that's going to do it for our reminders list. I think this has been a really great introduction into React, and I definitely encourage you to continue to play with your components and your applications that we have built in this lesson, and perhaps even try your hand at creating a couple of new components as well. In our very next lesson, we're going to take all of this great React stuff that we have learned, and we're going to apply it to the SharePoint framework.